الجلسة الثانية رح تكون بعنوان النيوليبرالية والمخيلات الحضرية. رح تتطرق هاي الجلسة لسياسات الدولة النيوليبرالية وتأثيراتها على المدينة وساكنيها في كل من لبنان، مصر والضفة الغربية في فلسطين. يشارك فيها كل من تالا علاء الدين من استوديو أشغال عامة لبنان، رح تكون أول المتحدثين. دكتور حسن موالحي من جامعة برلين التقنية وحدة الموئل، ودكتور كريم ربيع من جامعة إلينويز بشيكاغو. وزي ما قلت رح نبدأ مع تالا. تالا هي منسقة وحدة الأبحاث في استوديو أشغال عامة، وتالا هي مهندسة معمارية وباحثة حضرية ومنسقة في قسم الأبحاث في الاستوديو أشغال عامة مثل ما حكيت. وهي بدي أحكي عن المؤسسة تستند للأبحاث والمناصرة وتعالج اللامساواة المكانية في لبنان، ويشمل عمل المؤسسة دراسة وتحليل المخططات التي تقوم بها الدولة لمناطق لبنانية مختلفة، ومراقبة ممارسات مؤسسات التخطيط، والدعوة إلى منهجيات ومقاربات تشاركية في التخطيط وإعادة الإعمار. تالا ستقدم مداخلة حول رسم خرائط الأراضي العامة في لبنان، مطالبات مناهضة لسياسات الخصخصة. فرح أترك المجال لتالا. تالا معك 20 دقيقة، وبعدها ممكن يكون في سؤال أو اثنين، وممكن يكون في نقاش نهائي لجميع المتحدثين. تفضلي يا تالا.
مرحبا جميعا. أول شيء أنا كثير مبسوطة أن أكون جزء من هذا النقاش بالنيابة كمان عن فريق كل استوديو أشغال عامة. هلا أنا حضرت كليب برزنتيشن تبعي بالإنجليش، يعني شوي confusing إنه بين البوستر إنجليش والكونفرزيشن معكم بالإنجليش. بس نحن كل شغلنا بيكون بالعادة باللغة العربية وننشره باللغة العربية، فبركي بحب يكون النقاش من بعده يعني باللغة العربية.
رح يكون في ترجمة فما تقلقي، في ترجمة، ف يعني بتقدري تحكي باللغة اللي بدك إياها.
عم تشوفوا السكرين؟
عم نشوفها تالا.
اوكي. So مثل ما قلت البرزنتيشن تبعي التايتل تبعه هو Mapping Public Land in Lebanon Counter Claims to Privatization Policies. مثل ما بتعرفوا in Lebanon private interests have always been prioritized at the expense of public interest in the majority of planning and land management practices, decisions, and laws issued by the ruling system. This trade-off had a major effect on HLP rights and reinforced the land and housing commodification process and channeled financial investments in the built environment in the shadow of a rentier economy deriving its principles from the economic neoliberalism theory. Such practices have manifested themselves over the years in different ways by keeping, for example, 85% of the Lebanese territory unplanned, by implementing projects of land consolidation and reparceling, Damu Faris. In this presentation, I will focus on practices in which the ruling system neglected and gave up on public land, the state's real estate property, because we at Public Works Studio are currently immersed in an ongoing research focusing on these properties. So what was the context of this research? It's already known that Lebanon is facing an unprecedented economic and financial crisis, and means to save the state from an imminent bankruptcy and to allocate losses among stakeholders are widely being discussed. And of course, the tendency from the beginning was to burden the state with the greatest losses by privatizing its assets under the dominance of neoliberal thought. Starting the very beginning of the year 2020, we witnessed proposals, plans, and/or draft laws that enable banks and the private sector to seize the various state assets. The most interesting for us were real estate assets. The discourse on the privatization of state lands is based on estimates that the state's real estate constitutes about 20 to 25% of the Lebanese territory, but actually no one knows what the state owns, even the state itself. Public has no access to information about public lands, and there's a lack of data on such lands too. From here, our research purpose was to shed the light on such properties, their count, their types, their geographic distribution, their use, and more importantly, their sociocultural value that is totally neglected in the privatization discourse, despite the fact that they constitute our natural environment and provide a source of livelihood and housing for a wide range of people on the Lebanese territories. So now I'll present a part of the research, but I'll try not to bore you with details. In Lebanon, according to the Property Ownership Act, unlike in different Arab countries in the neighborhood, we have 5 types of state property, which fall under 2 categories: public state property and private state property. Within the public state property category, we have 1 type, which is called protected land, or in Arabic, al-aradi al-matruka mahmiya. And they are properties that belong to the state and that are de facto dedicated for public benefit. The seashore, lakes, rivers, ports, roads, public squares, etc. are deemed as public state properties. Within the category of private state lands, we have 4 types of state properties. 1, fully owned land, which is in Arabic mulk. Its owner, which is here the state, have full authority over it and have permanent ownership rights. The second type is Amiri land, which is a land owned by the state, but individuals can be holders of the right of disposal, or حق التصرف, and this right entitles its holder to use, exploit, and cultivate in Amiri land as they wish if the land use regulations permit so. This right is temporary and can be forfeited with non-use for a certain period. And such lands, Amiri lands, constitute the bulk of rural and agricultural land in Lebanon. Third, we have barren land or vacant open land, in Arabic al-aradi al-mawat or al-khaliya al-mubaha, which are also Amiri land owned by the state, but basically uncultivated or with conditions not suitable for cultivation, and where no one held a right of disposal yet. And at the end, we have communal land, which is a state land held as a unit by a corporate body, such as a village, under customary rights. These are very brief definitions of what each type of state land is. Just note that the main differences between the 2 main categories of state land are that the state can dispose of its private state properties, can sell them, give them away, or rent them for its own account under certain conditions and regulations, but on the contrary, cannot sell public state properties. And the private state properties are given plot numbers and recorded in the land register, but the public state properties are not given a number nor recorded in the land register unless any right is granted over them. In our research and based on data collected from the Ministry of Finance, we deducted the count of private state properties, the count per type and per geographic distribution over the Lebanese districts. As you can see on this map, more than 52% of these properties are Amiri lands, a total of 31,907 plots, which is a lot in comparison to the number of plots in Lebanon, followed by mulk lands, then communal lands. The geographic distribution shows that every district contains mulk lands. The distribution of communal lands is also diversified on the national level, but the majority of Amiri lands is located in the Bekaa, specifically districts like Baalbek, Rashaya, and West Bekaa, plus Akkar district in North Lebanon. From the 5 types of state properties, we chose basically to focus on 2. Protected land, which is the only type of public state land, and Amiri land, one of the 4 types in private state land. Now let's dig into each while tackling current and historical privatization processes. I'll start with public state properties or protected land. As I said earlier, while I gave a brief definition of these properties, the state cannot sell them as per the law, That's why we used to describe them the word protected for the public benefit, المصلحة العامة. But how private interests are being prioritized at the expense of this public benefit, and how are they being privatized? First, we have concession approval or exploitation of public state properties like the maritime domain is possible and made available to physical and or legal persons for the use for the purpose of pursuing economic activities. This exploitation is in theory only temporarily possible through authorizations and in return for payment, why not excluding or limiting the public use of these properties. However, authorized exploitation in Lebanon is mostly given for politicians and or powerful people and or real estate developers who are usually delinquent on payments, and their exploitation becomes illegally intensive and exceeds the authorized surface, the authorized time frame. Their occupation of the public property usually becomes permanent, while totally restricting access of the public to the public state properties. In addition, public state properties are subject to infringement and illegal occupation with no authorization, and it is in fact tolerated and sometimes facilitated by the state, like the facilitation we saw in some of the articles of the latest 2022 public budget. Third, illegal tournure أو مخرج مقاومة to sell this type of state property was introduced by the ruling system using what is called إسقاط decrees أو مراسيم الإسقاط. By issuing such decrees, the public benefit of these properties is dropped and public state land is transferred to private state land in order to sell it. We monitored the official gazette and we concluded that 831 ISQAT decrees were issued from 1933 till now. And this number could also be higher because illegally not all the ISQAT decrees are being listed in the official gazette, and such info is not accessed by the public. Also, the number of decrees does not indicate the area that has been dropped from public state property to private state property, as a single decree can drop big surfaces and many properties at the same time. We analyzed the pace of issuing such decrees and also their geographic distribution. I'll not prolong on these, but just note that the pace accelerated when the rentier economy was at its peak in Lebanon in the 50s. Also, the number of decrees in certain geographic areas was linked to the rule of a certain political figure or leader. Now, if we skip to talk about Amiri lands, as I said in the beginning, Amiri lands are lands owned by the state, but individuals can be holder of the right of disposal, حق التصرف. This right entitles its holder to use, exploit, and cultivate the Amiri land and construct in it as they wish if the land use regulation permits so. How can people obtain the right of disposal as per the Lebanese Property Ownership Act? The person may acquire the right of disposal of an Amiri land if 10 years have lapsed since the date of possession, وضع اليد happened publicly and in a calm manner, provided that the holder is cultivating the land. The holder of the right of disposal can transfer this right to another person or to his inheritors if he's deceased, but he cannot sell the Amiri land, as selling it is in the hand of the owner, which is the state. And to note that the right of disposal for Amiri land is forfeited if it's not used for a period of 5 years. So why we chose to focus on Amiri land as case study? They form 52% of the private state properties, as we saw on the map, and they have a social value. In fact, the existence of this huge percentage guarantees, based on the definition of this type of state land, the possibility of access to the land as a resource for agricultural production or housing for a large number of people in Lebanon, especially for women and marginalized group unable to rent or own for these two purposes, such as people with limited income or non-Lebanese. In fact, the acquisition of the right of disposal of an Amiri land takes place without paying any fee to the state, and therefore it is not limited to the wealthy social group, groups, unlike the process of acquiring the right of ownership in a private property that takes place through purchase, for example. Also, acquiring the right of disposal is not limited to holders of the Lebanese nationality, as any Palestinian, Syrian, or foreign resident can acquire this right according to the specific conditions mentioned in laws, decisions, and regulations. Most notably, there is a possibility of inheriting the right of disposal of an Emiri land equally between female and male inheritors if they are of the same degree of kinship with the deceased, which makes the possibility of access to land for women wider, especially among most Islamic sects in Lebanon, in which the right of ownership in private mulk lands is inherited according to Islamic Sharia principles, that is, on the basis of the male is in the luck of two females. The importance of the existence of this type of land in Lebanon also lies in the possibility of using, exploiting, and cultivating one Emiri land by a large number of individuals, which requires communal or collective management of the land, in contrast to what is encouraged by the discourse of sacred private property. Despite this importance, and in the light of the economic crisis and the situation I described at the very beginning of this presentation, a draft law was recently proposed at the parliament, which seeks to convert Emiri state lands into private mulk properties. Briefly, what this draft law proposes, it proposed to abolish the Emiri as a type of property from the land register, and to turn the right of disposal in Emiri lands to a right of ownership, which means the state will no longer be the owner of these 52% of its lands, and individuals will be granted full ownership of these properties. A draft law that seeks to fully privatize the Emiri lands, which is very problematic in the context of Lebanon. We will, of course, lose the positive points I mentioned while talking about the importance of such lands, but there are some additional problematic. The state is given up on 52% of its real estate property without nothing in return, while it's important to keep them as resources for future generations. 2, the privatization will turn these lands, which have a social value, into a commodity again and again. It will trigger the process of buying and selling them, which will lead to their accumulation in the hands of the financially, legislatively, and politically powerful minority that will employ them within the real estate and tourism sectors after dictating a new land use regulations in their favor. This will only provide those who have lost access to the land fragile contractual employment opportunities that do not guarantee a decent living. 3, it will have a huge impact on agriculture. About 80% of Emiri lands in Lebanon are in the Bekaa and Akkar, the bulk of the Lebanese agricultural lands. One of the conditions for the acquisition of the right of disposal of an Emiri land was to continuously cultivate it. And now with the proposal of the abolishment of this right, a lot of new owners will discontinue the cultivation and will look for selling the land for more gain. Here it is important to note that the members of the parliamentary who proposed the law are from the Bekaa, and that the demands of the MPs in these regions for years were centered around the consolidation and reparceling of land there under the slogan of protecting private individual property and stimulating the economy by allowing real estate speculation and the construction sector to flourish. And actually, a draft law for consolidation and reparceling in this region was recently proposed in conjunction with the draft law abolishing Emiri lands. A fourth problematic is that the right of disposal is not yet acquired on large surfaces of Emiri lands on the Lebanese territory, and the law is vague in this matter. To whom would the right of ownership be granted in this case? 5, the law has a negative impact on the non-Lebanese population, such as the Palestinians in particular, as a Palestinian can acquire a right of disposal of an Emiri land and benefit from its agricultural production in the light of the limited job opportunities for him in Lebanon, but he cannot be granted a right of ownership in the land if the law is enforced, because laws in Lebanon prohibit Palestinians from owning land. Last but not least, Many camps and informal settlements are today located on Emiri lands, and if the law was issued, this will generate and exacerbate land disputes. The city of Tyre in South Lebanon is an example of a location that will be affected dramatically by such law. 62% of its total surface is formed of Emiri lands, and you can see how camps on this map and whole neighborhoods are located on these lands. Palestinians also have right of disposal of agricultural Emiri lands in Tyre around the Rashidiyya camp since the 1948 and their arrival to Lebanon. And these lands were the source of their steadfastness during the siege of the camps during the war. So to conclude, issuing a SCOT degrees on public state properties, facilitating infringement on public state lands, and the draft law abolishing Emiri lands, coupled with the proposal of land consolidation and reparceling projects, are nothing but privatization attempts affecting land rights and are part of larger neoliberal policies aimed particularly in Lebanon at promoting the discourse of sacred private property and the expansion of real estate market and urbanizations, policies abolishing the social value of land and commodifying land and housing, and also generating housing vulnerabilities and eviction threats. Just at the end of my presentation, I'd like to mention that our research also focused on the names under which the state properties were registered in the land registry. And the process of understanding what these names stand for was also interesting for us, whether they are Emiri or Mulk or communal or barren lands. The private state lands are registered under a different name. The majority were registered under the name of the state or the Lebanese Republic itself, الدولة أو الجمهورية اللبنانية, and some were registered under the names of current or abolished public legal entities like a ministry or a general directorate. But from these names, we chose to focus on the three most interesting for us: the names of public entities that are or were concerned with housing, and thus the properties registered under their names are state land designated for housing, and the name of the Central Lebanese Bank, and the names of Musha, Baydar, Mar'a, and Umum. The time of the presentation is limited, so I won't be able to go through them, but we at Public Works are also studying the effects of current privatization attempts on such lands too. So I'll leave the floor to other presenter now. Thank you.
شكرا تالا على هذا العرض الشيق. ويعني نظام الأراضي العثماني اللي كمان فلسطين هي يعني بتتأثر فيه مثل لبنان، بظن هاي فرصة إنه نتعلم من التجربة اللي أنتم عم بتعيشوها، ونشوف معاكم كيف تبني نظام الأراضي الأميرية هو بيخلق فرصة لخلق نظام تشاركي بيسعى لربط الناس بالأرض كمصدر للرزق وليس كسلعة، والتفريق ما بين صاحب الأرض ومالك الأرض، وفكرة ماذا يعني مالك الأرض وما الفرق بينه وبين صاحب الأرض. هذه بحاجة لنقاش أكثر نطلع عليها ممكن فيما بعد. بعرفش إذا في هلأ أسئلة أو ننتقل للمداخلة الثانية ونخلي النقاش للآخر. إذا ما في حدا عنده أسئلة هلأ يعني ممكن ننتقل للزميل حسن موالحي. الزميل حسن موالحي من وحدة الموئل جامعة برلين التقنية، والزميل حسن يعمل حالياً كباحث رئيسي في وحدة الموئل منذ سبتمبر 2014. درس الهندسة المعمارية في جامعة القاهرة قبل استكمال الدبلوم في برلين. في العام 2014 أكمل درجة الدكتوراه بعنوان الثقافة والتنمية الحضرية غير الرسمية، حالة العشوائيات في مدينة القاهرة. ومداخلته اليوم حول تأملات في العمران النيوليبرالي في المنطقة العربية، وبتركيز خاص على حالة القاهرة أو ما تسمى العاصمة الإدارية الجديدة في القاهرة. بترك المجال لك يا حسن، تفضل.
تمام، شكرا جزيلا شادن. شايفين البرزنتيشن؟ شايفين السكرين تبعي؟
تمام.
تمام. طيب زي ما تفضلتي أنا المحاضرة تحتوي على مقدمة وبعض النظريات. التحول العمراني في مدينة القاهرة، العاصمة الإدارية الجديدة، حالة مثلث ماسبيرو، وبعد كده النتائج وبعض التوصيات. طيب زي ما يعني لا يغيب عنكم جميعا، بعض أو كثير من المدن العالمية العمران واخد شكل سريع في اتجاه البناء والارتفاع المباني المرتفعة في المنطقة العربية. طبعا لا تخلو من التجارب دي بقيادة دبي، خلينا نقول، اللي هي أصبحت إلى حد كبير مثل أعلى، خلينا نقول، لكثير من المدن في العالم. طبعا في بعض التجارب اللي ممكن بيبقى لها مدخل مختلف، مدخل بيئي، برضو موجودة في دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة كمثال. هذكر سريعا أهداف التنمية المستدامة وإزاي الهدف رقم 11 المفترض الوصول إليه حتى عام 2030، ان المدينه او المستقرات الانسانيه تبقى انكلوسيف للجميع، امان و ريزيلينت بتترجم مرنه ومستدامه. لو بنتكلم عن التنميه العمرانيه، هدفها الموازنه ما بين الحياه والعمل، بمعنى ان البيئه بتكون بتشجع الاستثمار والمشاريع، وفي نفس الوقت الافراد او السكان يكونوا حاسين بالراحه والانتماء. في جلوبال ساوث برضو الترجمه، معلش انا هتواجهني بعض الصعوبات في الترجمه. جلوبال ساوث من المصطلحات برضو الصعب، يعني ممكن نقول العالم الجنوبي او النصف الجنوبي من العالم، اللي هو طبعا مش توزيع جغرافي، لكن بيشار اليه او بيستخدم. بنتكلم على الدول الناميه. اغلب الدول في المنطقه برضو في مشكله ما بين تنفيذ التنميه، خلينا نقول، او المشاريع التنمويه بشكل هادف للربح. والمشاريع دي غالبا بتبقى هدفها ان هي تحقق دخل سريع، اللي هو بيغطي تكاليف التصميم والتنفيذ والاداره، وطبعا المستثمرين بيكسبوا من وراه. لكن فكره ان ازاي التنميه الحضريه او التخطيط والنمو الاقتصادي يبقى في بينهم حوار ونقاش يهدف في الاخر للمصلحه العامه، خلينا نقول. هنا بيجي دور المخططين بقى ومتخصصين التخطيط الاقتصادي. ازاي ممكن نربط بين التخطيط والتنميه الاقتصاديه من خلال المخططات والسياسات بشكل عام. يعني مثلا لما نيجي نتكلم على الاقتصاديين، لما بيتكلموا على رأس المال والعمالة ورأس المال البشري والتكنولوجي، وأخذنا عناصر أو عوامل زي البنية التحتية والخدمات اللي تشتمل على السكن والمدارس والمناطق الثقافية التاريخية ترفيهية. الناحية الثانية في مشاكل زي التلوث، الزحام المروري، ارتفاع معدلات الجريمة. كل دي لها علاقة أو بتأثر على التنمية أو النمو الاقتصادي بشكل عام. المخططين هنا لما بيجوا يعني يشتغلوا الحقيقة في بعض المفاهيم اللي بيحاولوا يحققوها، زي العدالة، التنوع، المسكن، affordable housing، المسكن مش عايز اقول رخيص بس اللي هو في المتناول، وبعض التولز او بعض الادوات اللي بيتم الاستناد اليها زي المشاركه المجتمعيه، السياسات الحكوميه الخاصه باستخدامات الاراضي وتنميه الاراضي. طيب برضو تعريف سريع بالنسبه للمشاريع الكبيره، زي ما قالت جاكوبس، ان المكاسب الاقتصاديه اخذت اولويه اعلى من احتياجات السكان. علماء الاجتماع برضو لما جم اتكلموا على دور التخطيط الحضري او التخطيط العمراني، بيستخدم بشكل كبير كوسيله تنميه اقتصاديه وتراكم راس المال، او يمكن اعتباره في بعض الاحيان كاداه للسلطه واسقاط الواقع السياسي على البعد المكاني. هنا بيبان الحقيقه دور التخطيط وعلاقته بالسياسات الدول والمفاهيم اللي بتتبناها بعض الدول. لو اخذنا مفهوم التنميه النيوليبراليه، فكره طريقه التنافس، وفكره في نظريه اللي هي الجلوبال سيتي، المدينه العالميه. الفكرتين دول الحقيقه بيتطابقوا او بيتقابلوا بشكل قوي جدا في التطورات اللي حصلت في المدن بشكل عام. في رأي فاينشتاين برضو اتقال في 99: يجب تشكيل مدينة بشكل هادف بدلا من نتيجة غير الوسيطة للسوق والتفاعلات داخل المجتمع المدني. بعبارة أخرى، التخطيط هو شرط ضروري لتحقيق القيم الحضارية، ومع ذلك فإن ما إذا كان التخطيط يؤدي بالفعل إلى نتائج مفيدة بشكل عام أم لا، يعتمد على الأهداف المختارة والآليات التي يتم من خلالها وضع السياسات وتنفيذها. طيب أنا هخش على طول على فكرة العمران أو عملية التشييد والبناء وأهميتها. لو بنتكلم على المباني ذات الارتفاعات العالية، هنلاقي إن هي بتوفر فرص عمل كتيرة في وقت قصير، بتوفر وحدات سكنية بعدد أكبر في مساحة أرض أقل. وده نتيجة إن في بعض المدن طبعا في مشكلة، يعني ندرة الأراضي، زي في دول زي اليابان ومصر. طبعا بنتكلم على الأراضي المعمورة، إن مصر فيها أراضي صحراء كتير فاضية. طيب هنا هيظهر بعض المفاهيم ليها علاقة بالدنسيفيكيشن زيادة الكثافة أو التكثيف والزحام مقابل توفير الخدمات زي الصحة والتعليم والبنية التحتية والتنقل أو الحركة. لأن برضو هنلاقي في مفهوم تاني، فكرة المكسب العالي مقابل المسكن المتاح، وعملية الجنتريفيكيشن، الجنترة أو الإحلال الطبقي اللي بيتم نتيجة لما منطقة يتم تحديثها أو يتم تطويرها، فبالتالي الأسعار والإيجارات بتزيد، فالفئة الساكنة بتضطر إن هي تترك المكان نتيجة إنها غير قادرة على دفع الإيجارات، وبيحل محلها الطبقة ذات دخل أعلى. يعني دي عملية برضو موجودة بتحصل في كتير من المدن. طيب فكره برضو صوره الحداثه، وفي المقابل الاستهلاك الطاقه، وفكره الفوت برنت بتاع الكربون. دي برضو من النقاط اللي يجب مراعاتها لما نيجي نتكلم على الارتفاعات العاليه، المباني ذات الارتفاعات العاليه. لو بنتكلم على الستيك هولدرز اللي ليها علاقه بالنوع ده من المشاريع، هنلاقي ان مش بس ستيك هولدرز والعناصر. تمام، لما بنتكلم على الارض، استخدامات الارض، البنيه التحتيه، التمويل، الاراده السياسيه، هنلاقي ان القوانين اللي بتنظم عمليه البناء ليها دور في شكل المنتج النهائي او في تشكيل العمليه نفسها. تمام، على مستوى بقى مستوى الدوله، او على مستوى فيدرالي حكومي اقليمي، او على مستوى محلي. لو بنتكلم على الحكومه، على جوه الحكومه، هنلاقي ان في وزارات مختلفه، كل وزاره فيها اقسام مختلفه. في عندنا قطاع خاص وفي عندنا قطاع عام. انا بتكلم على الحكومه، وبعد كده في عندنا قطاع خاص بيقدر ان هو بيدخل في شراكات معينه في اطار البنى، برضو ليه دور مع الاكاديميا طبعا والجامعات اللي بيبقى لها دور بحثي وتعليمي. منظمات المجتمع المحلي او المدني مع المنظمات الدوليه، كل دي اطراف ليها دخل في منظومه تشكيل العمران. طيب لو دخلنا على القاهره، طيب القاهره ليها الحقيقه يعني سمات معينه ما حدش يقدر ينكرها، ان هي تعتبر اكبر عاصمه في اقليم شمال افريقيا والشرق الاوسط، من حيث حجم عدد السكان. يعني القاهره لو بنتكلم على اقليم القاهره الكبرى فوق ال 22 مليون نسمه. القاهره لوحدها انا اتخيل يعني على اقل تقدير 12 مليون. في كعاصمه لمصر اللي هي عندها اكبر عدد سكان معديين ال 100 مليون، نسبه كبيره منهم متعلمه، و يعني قوه عماله قويه جدا موجوده في كتير من الاقطار العربيه. طيب هنشوف اللايرز اللي متشكله في القاهره. لو شايفين الابراج العاليه دي على كورنيش النيل، وراها في احياء الى حد ما تراثيه، اثريه، عشوائيات، كل الاشكال موجوده. عمليه urbanization او التمدن او التحضر بتحصل بشكل كبير جدا في الريف المصري. عمليه البناء بالخامات المحليه والتقليديه زي الطين وما الى ذلك تقريبا انتهت، وبقت ترمز للتخلف وعدم الحداثه والتمدن. الزحف العشوائي الحقيقه، او نمو العشوائيات في العمران المصري يشكل ارقام هائله. يعني نسب انا يعني ادعي ان هي تتعدى ال 60% مثلا من عمران القاهره يعتبر غير رسمي، وده بيوصل بنسب يعني تزيد او تقل في باقي المدن والريف المصري. ده الحقيقه على شكل موازي بقى فيه عمران العمران العشوائي او البناء غير الرسمي بيحل هنا، بيطرح حلول مختلفه لفئات معينه من السكان الغير قادرين على تحمل تكاليف المعيشه في مناطق مخططه زي المدن الجديده والمدن اللي بدأت في السبعينات. أنا هدخل هنا على طول. طيب ده تخطيط لمدينه القاهره الجديده، اللي هي مش العاصمه الاداريه. مدينه القاهره الجديده هي تقريبا ملاصقه لمدينه القاهره. ما اعرفش انتم شايفين السهم بتاعي، يعني هنا في طريق السويس واصل لمدينه السويس في الاقصى الشرق. هي تنتمي للجيل القديم من المدن الجديده في مصر، والى حد كبير اصبحت اجزاء كبيره منها معمره. يعني ساعات بتبقى زحمه جدا اماكن معينه، وفي حتت لسه بتنمو. يعني في اتجاه الشرق، كل ما اتجه شرقا في نمو. مدينتي دي مثلا مشروع قطاع خاص، مدينه حجما كبيره جدا، و يعني عايز اقول تم بناء نجاح، او يعني تم الترويج ليها بناء على نجاح مدينه الرحاب، اللي هي نموذج برضو من المدينه القطاع الخاص بيمتلكها وبيديرها، ونموذج الحقيقه يعني يقتدى به في اداره العمران. الجيتد كوميونيتيز او المجتمعات المبوبه هي مصوره ببوابات مش مفتوحه لعامه الناس. دايما يكون فيها امن، وفيها بعض الخدمات اللي بتلعب دايما على فكره ان احنا بنعوض النقص اللي موجود في العمران القديم، او بنقدم حاجات مش موجوده زي الخضره، زي يعني المساحات الخضراء، الاشجار، حمامات السباحه، مناطق ترفيهيه، فراغات عامه للسكان. وتطور لفكره المدن الجديده الحقيقه ظهرت العاصمه الاداريه الجديده. الكلام اللي جاي ده هبنيه على دراسه قمت بيها كفصل في كتاب بتكلم على السلطه والتنميه الحضاريه والظلم الاجتماعي، نموذج المصري الرسمي للنيو ليبراليه. طيب دي كانت روايه كتبها كاتب مصري اسمه دكتور احمد خالد توفيق الله يرحمه، كان بيتكلم فيها على اليوتوبيا، وهي تنتمي الى الساينس فيكشن، الخيال العلمي، لكن كان فيها اسقاطات. هي تم نشرها 2008 الحقيقه، قبل فكره العاصمه الاداريه دي يعني 7-8 سنين يمكن، 5 سنين. وكان فيها فكره الفصل الشديد ما بين الطبقات الهوة الساحقه بين ذوي الدخل العالي جدا وفكره ذوي الدخل المنعدم. ويعني طيب هنتكلم على العاصمه الاداريه الجديده اللي تم اعلانها 2015، وهي تبعد حوالي 60 كيلومتر من قلب العاصمه القديمه اللي هي القاهره. و الحقيقه برضو هي تم اعلانها او ترويج ليها بفكره ان هي هتجذب سكان القاهره، وان هي تقلل العبء على البنيه التحتيه للعاصمه وتقلل الكثافه. في البدايه تم يعني نشر صور ليها علاقه ازاي المدينه دي هيكون شكلها، واضح ناطحات سحاب، والتمويل ما كانش ظاهر لسه برضه هيبقى جاي منين. فكره ان السنوات السابقه من 10 سنين كان في بعض يعني لو بنتكلم على ثورات وعدم الاستقرار السياسي، ده خلى شويه الانظمه تتجه ناحيه مش عايز اقول مغازله الشعوب، ولكن محاوله ارضاء الشعوب ومحاوله كسبهم لصالحه، وفي نفس الوقت محاوله اظهار القوه بشكل ان احنا نقدر نقود الفتره الصعبه دي من تاريخ الدوله. وكان الحقيقه ده بيتطلب اظهار مظاهر القوه دي من حيث حجم المشاريع وكميه المشاريع والفترات القصيره جدا للتنفيذ، اللي فعلا نجحت ان هي تبهر كثير من الناس، انه ازاي كل ده بيتعمل في الوقت القصير ده، وفعلا انجازات ضخمه، مشاريع قوميه كتير، منهم قناه السويس الجديده، منطقه قناه السويس، مشاريع انشاء الطرق وهكذا، اكبر مسجد، اكبر كنيسه، اعلى مبنى. طيب، فكره التاثر بدبي كمثل اعلى ومثال للحداثه والتطور العمراني، الحقيقه لها تاثير مش بس على مصر او الخطاب الرسمي، لكن برضو في عواصم كتير حول العالم. ومش مجال ان انا انقد او اناقش، لكن دي حقيقه. لو بنتكلم على العاصمه تاني الاداريه، فكره ان مين عنده الحق ان هو يوصل للعاصمه الاداريه، يقدر ان هو يسكن فيها او يأجر فيها او الحقيقه للاسف اعداد او ارقام الوحدات اللي تم طرحها انها تكون في متناول محدود الدخل تقريبا صفر. في مدن حواليها تم يعني تطويرها والبناء فيها بحيث ان هي تبقى اماكن للناس اللي عندها شغل في العاصمه الاداريه الجديده ومش هتقدر انها تسكن هناك، فتقدر تسكن في اماكن قريبه، وده ادى طبعا لنمو زياده الاسعار بشكل رهيب. يعني ممكن برضو اعدي النقطه دي سريعا. فكره النهر الاخضر، وفكره انه وجود اسباب او خلق اسباب معينه لتكون حجه او مبرر لرفع اسعار بشكل معين. يعني مثال النهر الاخضر، وجود قطع اراضي او مباني بتطل عليه، ده ادى نسب تميز اعلى جدا. فكره المسجد، فكره الكنيسه، اعتقد ان هي لاند مارك صحيح، لكن في نفس الوقت هي بتضيف مبررات للتسويق العقاري انه يرفع من اسعاره. فكره بقى ملاعب الجولف والفلل والقصور كاعلانات في مناطق مختلفه من المدينه، الحقيقه كانت اثارت تساؤل كثير من الخبراء. في الشكل ده بحاول اربط ما بين العاصمه الاداريه والمستثمرين العقاريين والشركه اللي تم انشائها والدعايه والقطاع الخاص مع الوزاره، وزاره الاسكان ووزاره الدفاع، وعلاقه ده بالمناخ السياسي اللي كان مسيطر على مصر في الفتره دي. 2014 كان بدايه ترشيح الرئيس عبد الفتاح السيسي، والعاصمه الاداريه تم اعلانها 2015. فاللي انا عايز اقوله ان هي تعتبر مشروع قومي ارتبط ببرنامج الرئيس بشكل ما، وكل الاطراف بتشتغل مع بعض بشكل مباشر، انها بتدعم الاطراف الاخرى وبتحقق مكاسب بشكل ما وبتقدم خدمات بشكل اخر. فكره ملكيه الارض، وازاي ان ارض فاضيه فجاه تتحول من انها بدل ما كانت بلا اي قيمه، فجاه تتحول انها بتباع بالاف الجنيهات، الاف الدولارات. يعني دي فكره الحقيقه موجوده من زمان. بيع وشراء الارض سواء يعني تم تطويرها او لا، بيساعد بشكل او بيسهم بشكل كبير جدا على فكره انتاج الفراغ، زي ما قال كثير من علماء الاجتماع. في حاله العاصمه الاداريه الحقيقه هي الارض هي بدايه فكره المشروع. عندنا ارض فضاء القرب من القاهره، قريبه من طريق سريع. طب ما احنا دي بدايه الفكره. لو بنتكلم على علاقات القوى في المستويات السياسيه العليا، فكره ان احنا نحقق دخل كبير دي للدوله في الفترة اللي كانت اقتصاديا فيها صعوبة جدا. أعتقد دي فكرة لقت قبول ونجاح من القائمين على الأمور. نتكلم على الباور، على السلطة. مش مقصود بيها هنا سلطة سياسية، لكن اللي بيمتلك السلطة هنا بيتم الاستناد إلى على بعض المصادر. كمية الدخل اللي بتحققه وزارة ما، أنا بتكلم دلوقتي جوه داخل منظومة السلطة، في صراعات داخلية. بنتكلم على الوزارات وبعضها، أنا بتكلم برضو بشكل عام، ده بينطبق على حالة مصر طبعا، لكن في نفس الوقت ده كلام ممكن يتم تطبيقه في نظريات تحليل السياسية أو التنمية وعلاقتها بالسياسة. هنلاقي إن الدخل دايما بيمثل عنصر إيجابي في تقييم أداء المنظومات. طيب، العاصمة الحقيقة هي
حسن بعد إذنك إحنا تعدينا الوقت
حالا أنا خلاص دي الكونكلوجن. طيب، دور الدولة، يعني تأثير العاصمة الإدارية على إسكان القاهرة أو السوق العقاري. الحقيقة هي بتوعد بحياة أفضل والخروج من المشاكل اللي موجودة في المدن القديمة زي ما قلنا. دي نقطة أساسية بتساند عليها. وفي نفس الوقت فكرة التنمية الاجتماعية والتنمية العمرانية، الدولة هنا شايفاهم إن هم حاجتين منفصلتين. بمعنى بنشتغل على العشوائيات، دي قصة، وبنشتغل على المدن الجديدة قصة تانية. فكرة إن إحنا الدمج أو فكرة عدم الفصل ما بين الطبقات، دي فكرة غير موجودة. أنا ممكن أقف هنا. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا حسن على هذا العرض، ويعني عرض بيطرح كتير أسئلة. يعني أول شيء بنقوله شو رح يكون مستقبل القاهرة؟ كيف علاقة الناس اللي رح تسكن هون بالقاهرة؟ مين السكان اللي رح يسكنوا هون؟ قديش مثل هيك نموذج رح يعزز الفصل الطبقي اللي هو موجود أصلاً، ويعزز الفارق ما بين أفراد المجتمع. يعني بنفس الوقت يعني عم بفكر بالحالة الفلسطينية وإيش اللي عم بيصير بفلسطين في ضمن نفس الإطار، وإنشاء مدن جديدة. واللي هلأ زميلنا كريم ربيع رح يتعرض لهذا الموضوع. كريم ربيع موجود حالياً في شيكاغو، وأستاذ في علم الأنثروبولوجيا في جامعة إلينوي. وكريم بيركز في أبحاثه وعمله على الخصخصة والتنمية الحضرية ومشروع بناء الدولة في الضفة الغربية. عمل سابقاً كأستاذ مساعد في الأنثروبولوجيا بالجامعة الأمريكية بواشنطن العاصمة، وحصل على زمالة هاربر شميت من جامعة شيكاغو، كما حصل على زمالة ماري كوري كباحث رئيس في مركز الهجرة والسياسة والمجتمع بجامعة أكسفورد. أمضى كريم 2020-2021 في إجازة بحثية من المجلس الأمريكي للجمعيات العلمية ومؤسسة فيرنر جرين ومؤسسة جراهام للتقدم في الفنون الجميلة، وكان باحثاً زميلاً زائراً في جامعة مدينة نيويورك. فكريم الآن سيشارك بمداخلة بعنوان التخطيط الوطني والأيام القادمة. لا أدري إذا الترجمة مناسبة كريم للعنوان بالإنجليزية. والإسكان ومأسسة الدولة في فلسطين أو في الضفة الغربية في فلسطين. تفضل كريم.
Thank you so much. I'm going to speak in English today.
Yeah.
So first of all, I have to thank Professor Shadden for inviting me in for commenting, to Selsen for organizing, and to Tala and Hassan for their talks. And to, of course, everybody for attending. It's my pleasure to be with you today. Also, I'm not an architect, so I'm just going to talk and not show pictures. I hope that's okay. Today, I want to talk about planning, national planning, and privatization at the urban scale. The organizers have asked me to speak for about 20 minutes, but given the time of everything, I'm going to try to edit a bit as I go along. So let me situate the talk a bit. I've recently published my book on privatization and housing development in the West Bank and how it's intertwined with the state building project. I make a lot of arguments about the political economy of the state and the way that Palestine is being crafted as a state scale market translatable to other such scales of market organization, and that's the kind of stuff I talk about. In the book, I move through planning to try to understand the big picture. Here I'm going to kind of try to do the reverse and tell you some thoughts about planning itself as a way to chart how state scale political ideology and change are negotiated, touch the ground, and are made manifest in Palestine, and what that process can tell us about political economy and the future being elaborated there. I want to analyze the shift from Oslo era national planning for a future sovereign government to contemporary planning emphasizing the state essentially as a scale of market organization to ensure future economic growth. So what happened was it went from emphasizing local, practical, material concerns for citizens such as housing and distribution to organizing around abstractions and cultivating, for example, a population of homeowners. The big picture of the current West Bank state in the making goes something like this. What better form of local governance could the settler regime want than one that does not affect the sovereign state, allows territorial and practical control, creates new opportunities for accumulation in Israel, and does not incorporate the native population as equal citizens? In what ways is the current condition of governance in Palestine an anomaly in our present? Is it possible, as Nasser Abu Rahma has asked, to think across Palestine and other contexts of stripped down economy, say in Detroit under emergency management, or the sovereignty of nearly state scale governance and peacekeeping missions, towards something like what Nasser says is a post-austerity shift from the sovereign moment of decision-making to the duration of management. So one of the things we're talking about with planning is management over time. Planning matters here because it's a set of practices and state-scale interventions. It's a shifting terrain for national ideological and material projects to stabilize and orient Palestine, even though Palestine is suspended by political conflict. Here's how Hiba Abu Aked puts the mutual emergence of development and planning and asks what can happen when planning narrows and, quote, loses its ethical basis in socioeconomic development. That is, in efforts to address social inequality, poverty, spatial justice, and the redistribution of resources. What she says is that it becomes little more than a tool for ordering space in the interest of those in power, devoid of the normative attributes of equity and social justice that are usually attributed to planning practice. So, I mean, I think you can see that shift in the two talks that we just heard. The Palestinian context is different, and in some ways actually kind of a simpler one than Hiba's Lebanon, because planning is not about a war yet to come, but about imagining a peace yet to come that kind of nobody really expects will arrive. So management over time is a partial outcome, I think, of a kind of perpetual planning for the day after, for a future that no one seriously believes will emerge, but which is having material effects on the present contours of politics, class, and social life and social reproduction in Palestine. So planning for a privatized state means that those ideas of equity are already structured by class and by access to aspiration. Justice is distributed by the private sector by its own sense for what counts. Planning and consolidation in Lebanon are in part about protection against future losses. In both Palestine and Lebanon, planning is an ongoing process composed of messy practices and productive work being done that solidifies wider social and political economic relations. So that's how I'm trying to toggle between social life and social reproduction and planning in the state. So I'm proceeding from a handful of assumptions here about the state, privatization, and financialization. First of all, in the literature, Palestine has been treated in such a way as to make links to the world scale really invisible. It's typically understood as some kind of a world historical exception, isolated and unknowable, except through the history of Zionist colonization. So instead, I want to superimpose the shift in planning practice onto the shift in political economic practice in order to explore some of how financialization works there today. So one thing to keep in mind about this is that the case is a little bit different because we're not talking about a state that needs a Reagan or a Thatcher to push neoliberal reforms that smooth contemporary process of financialization. Instead, we're starting from scratch and the state is being purpose-built as a scale of economic organization. So, okay, capitalism and neoliberalism are worldwide dynamic processes of unequal incorporation. As Andy Clarno has described it, neoliberalism is a context-specific process of political, economic, and social change. It is, after all, a form of capitalism. The scholarly literature on neoliberalism is huge, but a handful of features are most relevant to my study. First, privatization is part of the continuous formation of the state, governance, and state civil society relations, and is often a response to administrative and political problems. Second, neoliberal forms of capitalism extract labor value, but do not replenish social reproductive capacity either through wages, types of infrastructure development, or state forms of aid such as healthcare. Third, the production of labor power has cultural and social dimensions. Finally, the nation state, while it was never totally self-sustaining or bounded, is now almost entirely a node in a global political economy. So the inherent capitalist imperatives for accumulation presuppose certain kinds of states and relations between them. Neoliberalism means the responsive reformation and repurposing of the state in line with those imperatives. The growth of financial capitalism historically and the increased importance of finance over production today has also enabled and required structural change. That included greater support and intervention on behalf of more and more non-competitive monopolistic capital. And then come deepening forms of financialization. The term has a lot of definitions, but what I mean and what I think most of us are probably talking about is something like the process of extending markets and market logics to everything, including to capital itself, which has material effects and consequences on politics and logics and practices and so on. So what we're talking about is growth and accumulation without direct appropriation of value. And so you get growth balanced on top of a roiling undercurrent of instruments and obligations and so-called risky practices. And while it does generate instability and fluidity at the most general scale, it can also produce nodes of stability for a time necessary for accumulation, like especially fixed capital in cities, in law and policing, and so on, as well as obviously accumulation itself, because otherwise, why would you do it? Now, one way that city scale planning becomes state and market planning is through building and real estate, by using credit to get capital moving and accumulating debts. So construction is the thing that's driving planning, demand, and deregulation, as Susan Feinstein puts it. So in this framework, plans come in as articulations of state orientation. Such plans and their reflections in the built environment inflect material social reproduction and politics. Social reproduction, which is within and reproduces modes of relations of production. So I think that I'm sort of looking at planning from the reverse angle, as Hassan did. State scale planning presupposes neoliberalism's diminished relationships between the state and its citizens. At the urban scale, it's plans for accumulation in space, and then we come to home ownership. Planning contains and is a series of ideas about the future. So I'm trying to ask something like, what happens when this form of planning is in part the process that's used to generate both fixity and stability? The shift in approach in Palestine. The next steps for those empowered to plan are pretty clear and logically coherent. The question for them is how to stabilize the foundation for a future in which full sovereignty is doubtful at best. How to both orient a state and do strategy in an already uneven global political economy that emphasizes circulation over production. And how, for us, do ideas about plans and stabilization change when confronted with problems of a global political economy in which states no longer worry about social reproduction? Which is also an interesting question because it's something that Palestine has never really had the ability to worry about as a question of general or state scale governance. So since Oslo, planning has served changing political imperatives. First, to formalize activity on the landscape, and second, as a language for enforcement and to circumscribe Palestinian existence and possibility. Today, it's used to open previously unprofitable land to capital investment, but that approach was not preordained. The PA operationalizes confusion, but prior to the Fayyad regime, there were attempts to use it to establish an alternate political and spatial practice that served Palestinians and worked explicitly towards a future state. So in the Oslo era hopefulness of the mid and late 1990s, the Palestinian-led planning movement emerged in one part of the PA. The 1998 National Plan was the first serious attempt in more than a decade to institute a legal, formal, comprehensible planning regime for the West Bank, as well as at the time in GIZ. Palestinian planners set out to use their new authority under the PA to create a comprehensible system, as well as a roadmap for formalizing Palestinians' interactions with the built environment for the future. Now, planners knew that their authority in the moment could be fleeting, so they attempted to fix certain things such as regional planning and resource use. And they came up with a detailed plan that was ultimately stymied structurally and legally and had no power or possibility for implementation. Now, the plan frames its goals in terms of the need to create a responsive framework for fixing the structural, physical, economic, and environmental problems that decades of occupation have created for Palestine. And as Palestinians gained greater sovereignty over the parts of the West Bank and GIZ, they had to build capacity at the same time as they defined land use and provided an overall vision for linking and growing regional settlement. So here's how they thought about their remit. There's never, this is a quote, in modern times been planned development of the built-up environment in the West Bank. The West Bank has been encroached and divided by external rulers without structuring in relation to economic forces or an administrative political order. There's been no development strategy for population distribution, nor allocation of land for future expansion. The system of built-up areas developed more or less randomly and wherever possible, scattered by man-made interference, with the topography lacking the essential interlinking infrastructure in terms of network facilities that create a mature and well-developed settlement system. So that's what they were trying to do. The technocrats in the Ministry of Planning were arguing for a robust, diligent system that would help oversee Palestine's transition to a centralized state in the following years by curbing bad planning and bad development. Their planning was based on needs rather than forecasting or speculation, and it presupposed a much different day after the occupation than the private sector and presentist approaches to planning do today. I have a lot of quotes, so I'm gonna try to skip them. So the preface sort of continues on talking about sort of the ambition that they had because of Oslo. They said that their baseline was like this. It is assumed by the year 2005, Palestinians will have full authority over the entire West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Borders will be open between Palestine and other countries, and the bulk of Palestinian refugees will start returning to Palestine. They continued to say that it's presupposed by then that East Jerusalem will be under Palestinian sovereignty. It's assumed that settlements will come under Palestinian authority after the year 2005. The 1998 plan also talks about universal needs of economic growth and development, sustainability, resource use, and crucially to me, I think, a fair distribution of income and welfare among individuals for the benefit of all. So it's true that many of the assumptions in those plans, especially the idea that Ramallah, Beirut, and Jerusalem could be considered a single urban unit, are no longer hold. However, prior plans assumed Palestinian political autonomy. They aimed to eradicate some of the worst legal and material effects of the occupation, and they did not presuppose and work around colonial boundaries. Now, today, in the vacuum of the Oslo framework, planning of the contemporary state building period looks different. Similar to what we saw in Lebanon and in Egypt, in line with contemporary global political, economic, and governance logics today, the Palestinian leadership and capitalist class benefit from the lack of formality and planning. The Ministry of Planning, in fact, no longer has the directive to conduct national planning of this type. Instead, it produces optimistic reports of institution building to international donors. Moreover, the 2003 Constitution enshrines free market capitalism as the sole economic system for Palestine. So no longer are we talking about distribution of resources. Planning is as rhetorical and ideological as it is material. It exists within and becomes a component of the occupation and aid economies, and planning and law are designed to encourage privatization and value extraction from the landscape. Politics, laws, and national priorities were reoriented, and the desire for formalization turned into the need for openness. Whatever problems previous plans sought to address were opened to the market and to profit-making intervention. So planning is a question of state, not only because of the scale of intervention, but because one of the primary ways that ideas enter the government is through this kind of planning. Groups of developers and bureaucrats make their visions authoritative, sensible, and legitimate, and they incorporate people as they shift government priorities and goals. So I talk here about some of the various sort of national plans with titles like ending the occupation, Palestine moving forward, building the state a success story, things like that. I've written about it elsewhere, so if anybody is really interested in that, email me and I can send it to you, but I'm just going to skip that over. Beyond titles that seem at best aspirational, these plans are productive. They represent, describe, and orient government reforms. They elaborate priorities and activities, but they also propose and create opportunities, mechanisms, and justification for aid and private sector responsibility over public governance. So this is how I think the relationship between planning and privatization works, and in part about privatizing the state itself. And they become the basis for the stuff that follows. So what that means practically and why planning is important is that this form of planning for privatization and market stability produces social relations among Palestinians as it solidifies structural ties between the West Bank and Israel. Now, international political economy and events at multiple scales can bear directly on individuals' lives. And in complicated and murky ways, as we all know, international aid has been reoriented as investment. So personally, I look at contemporary housing development, and you can see it clearly when aid is used for things like providing mortgage loan guarantees that insulate Palestinian banks from potential default. This in turn makes foreign investment in private housing development feasible because risk is minimized in the name of political and economic development. And attempts to create stability in a colonized territory through foreign investment, class consolidation, and capital accumulation, to me, lead to little change in the broader context of Israeli political and territorial control, but increasingly orient individual practice towards class aspiration and also towards debt service. And that orientation, that outward orientation, is part of the context for social life and future-oriented thinking and practice within Palestine. As Hiba has also written, planning is a form of anticipation and a form of urban governance and production. Now here, the entire scaffolding of the Palestinian state is basically anticipatory. Now, despite few believing in a future of change, they're formalizing anticipation in the present. The day after is not an outcome, but an organizing principle for stabilization. I have some stuff about Kiana Yamada Taylor and her work on housing and sort of how housing value and predatory inclusion sort of bind people. But let me try to tie this together here. I look at large-scale debt-financed upscale housing developments, and they're places that clearly show the responsiveness and scale of planning to external investment and financialization. And what I think is that through the state, the nationalist bourgeoisie is trying to delink big capital from the occupation and allow Palestine to more fully enter a world market. Financial normalization may change the status of normal as far as capital accumulation is concerned, and it's helping a state and economy emerge from the raw materials of the normal conditions of occupation. Everyday life is constructed around the needs to live life every day. Palestinian ideas of normalcy are potentially affected and altered by changes to this wider context. Now, normalization can mean class aspiration and accumulation as well as consolidation of present conditions. Taken individually, not all these activities are so clear-cut, and it's important to emphasize that racial, political, geographic, and economic segregation are consequences of Israeli colonization. But taken together, they represent the effort to transcend division with business, to deracialize Palestinian and Israeli capital, and to profit from the situation. Politics, the law, and people's aspirations may be changing as a result of the state building project, just as they change and contribute to it. A new Palestinian state is emerging in the West Bank under settler colonial rule. It frames open markets, but it is a truncated and circumscribed openness. Uneven development is still a kind of development and movement. If the state building project explicitly attempts to create, master plan, and map a middle class also contributes to the state building project. Many Palestinians are waiting for opportunities in places where they can extract a normal, stable life. Debt, new state, and new types of housing potentially provide a new long term. So that's what the day after is about. Class aspiration and occupation can exist simultaneously, and laws then are sort of entering back into the state and are being reformed to create the administrative capacity for widespread change. Many people, of course, benefit from the occupation, and aspiration and planning for the day after does not necessarily mean the desire to revolutionize the present. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, كريم. حقيقة أنا عندي مجموعة من الأسئلة أو كمان يعني اوكي انا حاطه كنت فمش عارفه يمكن ناخذ سؤال او سؤالين وبعدين ننتقل لأمبريتا تمبرا اذا في مجال. حسن
موجود، أمبريتا موجودة.
اوكي يعني بعرفش اذا كان في اسئله عند المشاركين. اذا لا
هو أنا ممكن أقول تعليق؟
تفضل حسن.
هو يعني تعقيب كده على الثلاث مداخلات من تالا ومن كريم، مني ومن كريم. أعتقد يعني الموضوع بيقودنا ناحية أهمية دور الأرض حقيقة، وشايف إن ده مقدمة هائلة للمداخلة القادمة من أمبريتا، رغم اختلاف الظروف ورغم اختلاف الظروف الاقتصادية والاجتماعية والسياسية في الدول. يعني لو بنتكلم على وضع احتلال، بنتكلم على وضع بعد الثورة ونظام جديد بيحاول يظهر بشكل معين، بنتكلم على نظم قديمة موجودة وورثناها، قوانين بتحاول انها تحل التعقيدات. اعتقد الارض هي الاساس لاي عملية اعمار وبناء، تمام، تنمية عمرانية. فالتعقيدات الموجودة حاليا في الدول المختلفة تحتاج مجهود أكتر، تحتاج بحث أكتر، تحتاج طرح اقتراحات، حلول، لأن لو الوضع فضل زي ما هو الدنيا مش هتتحل. يعني ده مجرد بس تعقيب سريع مع اختلاف وجهات النظر واحترام للظروف المختلفة طبعا. بس يعني شكرا
حسن. تالا حابة تحكي شيء؟
ايه هلا انا بالنسبه المداخلات الثلاثه دائما كان مثل ما عم بيقول الاستاذ حسن انه الرابط الاساسي انه كان اهميه الارض والقيمه الاجتماعيه للارض، وكيف دائما بالحالة الثلاثة بالبلدان الثلاثة عم بيصير في تسليع لها، عم بيصير في وضع هيدا الرأس المال لإنتاج عقارات جديدة للاستثمار العقاري، والأشخاص اللي عم يستثمروا هن أو لصالح المستثمرين المطورين العقاريين والنافذين والسياسيين. ودايما هذا الشيء عم بيكون مش مرتبط بحاجات السكان. يعني انا اذا بدي ارجع اعطي اكزامبل ليش عم بيصير تفكير بانه الغاء الاراضي الاميريه بمنطقه البقاع، او انه يصير في عمليات ضم وفرز هي لانتاج عقارات جديده للبناء وللتطوير العقاري، وبراسهم في افكار من تجارب سابقه صارت بمدن ثانيه وكانت فاشله، يعني مثل بطرابلس بشمال لبنان صار في عملية ضم وفرز منطقة نيو تريبولي برات المنطقة القديمة مثل ما كان عم يشرح الأستاذ حسن، مثل بكال القاهرة. فاللي صار إنه نقلوا عملوا عقارات جديدة، بنوا أبنية جديدة مرتفعة بتختلف عن الأبنية القديمة، واللي صار إنه هيدا الأبنية vacant يعني فاضية. فمش دايما عم بيكون هيدي التوجهات أو هيدي الممارسات هي لصالح أو لحاجات السكان.
شكرا تالا. واللي بتقوليه بذكرني في مثال كتير قريب من مدينتي. أنا ساكنة برزيت، جنبنا في مدينة جديدة طلعت، هي مدينة روابي، طلعت على أراضي الفلاحين الفلسطينيين، ومثل ما حكيتي طلعت المدينة مباني عالية والمباني لهلأ فاضية. فزي كنا بنحكي عن نفس القصة بتتكرر في كل محل، بس لهلأ ما تعلمنا الدرس إيش بدنا نعمل، كيف بدنا نتعامل مع هاي الإشكالية. وإحنا كأكاديميين أو باحثين أو خبراء أو مناصرين أو يعني مؤسسات بحثية خارج إطار الأكاديمية، خلينا نحكي، بحاجة إنه يعني يكون في عنا سبل جديدة للتعامل مع هذا الواقع، سبل نوعا ما خلينا نقول خلاقة. نحط هاي النماذج الجديدة ونشوف كيف ممكن إنه يتغير في الواقع، ويعني نقدر زي ما قلنا نحقق فكرة العلاقة مع الأرض كمصدر للرزق، وليس كسلعة عقارية زي ما عم بنشوف. كريم، بعرفش إذا حابب تحكي شيء قبل ما ننتقل للسيدة أمبريتا تمبرا.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly. I mean, I think that these comments are really, I mean, appropriate. I agree with what everyone's saying. I think the land question is really vital, like in Tala's work, because it's showing also why that this is a much wider state, much wider political question, but also a state question, a question of like state orientation and what the state does. The case of Rawabi is one where there's the largest sort of istimlak, eminent domain project in the West Bank to date. And then the other thing I just wanted to say, which I also thought about during Hassan's talk, is that the sort of like the planner's idea of inwards and upwards, also, and you know, sort of skyscraper building or building at height, is also like has this strange sort of political connotation in Palestine, because obviously the reason that there's not land available for natural growth or for spreading out is because of the occupation planning regimes, because of the, you know, the sort of the ability and the capacity of Palestinians to build on their own land. So then planning becomes also this complicated political mess where, you know, the UN Habitat says Palestinians need to build inwards and upwards, but there's all this land that they can see right there that they ought to be building on.
اوكي، ثانك يو ربيع. وانا مضطره انهي هذا النقاش هون، يعني كنت بحب انه نقدر ناخذ اسئله، بس احنا في وقت كتير ضيق وضايل اخر محاضره. رح اترك المجال لزميلي حسن يقدم السيده أمبريتا تمبرا، وشكرا لكم. شكرا كتير. شكرا.
طيب so I switch to English. So as Umbretta will present in English, so I'd like to welcome Mrs. Umbretta Tempra. She is a human settlements officer and the land specialist, land, housing and shelter section in the urban practices branch, global solutions division, regional office for Arab states. We cooperated together before on different fields, and I thought that, I mean, when it comes to Arab urbanism, and land has to be mentioned and highlighted, and I think her experience in the field and in the region would add to our knowledge and inform our audience somehow about how land and urbanism are interrelated, and I think it's such a great introduction, this previous session, to the coming keynote. So please, Umbretta, the floor is yours. I know that you have a meeting in 12 minutes, so maybe you would go 5 minutes late there. Please start.
Thank you so much, Hassan, and thank you so much for TUM and Birzeit University for having me. It was a pleasure and also very good to listen to the previous sessions. The few presentations I heard were very interesting. I will be talking about land governance and how that is important for the management of the urban environment. And I know you had a long afternoon, so I'll try to be quite brief, but it's a very important aspect or lens through which looking at urban dynamics. And we know that cities are shaped by many different forces and elements, but sometimes those that are related to land are not sufficiently monitored, understood, and actually governed because of them being sometimes invisible, or the information is not available or consolidated. So what is actually land governance? What do we mean by that, and what are the components? It has actually different components. You see on the screen the key ones that are part of it. And some of these, regionally speaking, are better addressed, better understood, also better taught in the universities, in the training institutes than others. For example, the region is quite strong in land use, therefore all the planning aspects, regardless of not that gets translated fully into functioning plans, but it is a dimension that is there's a lot of capacity understanding in the region, while others are not as well researched. Particularly land tenure pattern and land tenure rights, we found it is quite weak in the way is looked at. And it's very, very important in the urbanization processes. So what is this actually? You know, it basically who has rights to what, where, for how long, and who has the right to decide about the allocation, the transfer of these rights. As well as land value, there would be the need to understand the different dimension of the land value, the land markets, the prices of land, the estimating the costs of, for example, purchasing, transferring, compensating people when they need to move for urban development, because this has really a lot of implication also for the ability of local authorities to plan for introducing services and infrastructure, and makes actually reliable estimates on how to direct the urban development. Land information as well is an area of improvement. There is a lot of technological capacity to do so. It's increasing in the region. Some countries are maybe stronger than others, and new technologies are definitely an opportunity. But to collect the land-related information, updating it, analyzing it, and actually consolidating and using it for decision-making on urban planning or urban development, it needs improving. Dispute resolution as well, it's the capacity and maybe the knowledge of some of the land dynamics among those that actually resolve disputes, either in the formal courts or maybe in the community level courts or dispute resolution mechanism, could be strengthened. So overall, I mean, all these components come together in composing the land governance, which of course need to be aiming at promoting and sustaining social economic development, human rights, peace, and stability. Sometimes in the region, these different components of land governance are treated a bit within their own technical domain as a bit of an end in itself, while in fact the way these administrative process of land governance processes are not actually assessed and evaluated in their capacity to deliver to the needs of the society in terms of this broader goal, because at the end, the technical processes are meant to achieve these goals. I just picking of the very key excellent topics of the symposium, I wanted to briefly say that the link obviously between informality and land governance is very tight. Actually, we see that informality is basically generated by the insufficient service, the insufficiency of service suitable land that can be legally and formally acquired. This is basically the root cause of informality. And even if, which actually affects about 40% of urban residents in the Arab region. And definitely, you know, to move out of informality in the settlements where this is possible and politically or environmentally feasible, there is need to regularize the settlements, which has obviously an element of upgrading, introducing services, infrastructure, perhaps amelioration to the structure, but there is a very key underlying element of the legalization of the land tenure rights. I don't want to spend more on that because I think it's an area where actually there is capacity knowledge in the region, but maybe touching on the other theme, which was the one of refugee, displaced, and migrants, and what are the implications for land governance. A quick overview of the numbers. We see that actually the population is at the moment 60% urban and increasing. 90% of people live on just 4% of the land, which make the criticality of urban development very acute. And a very large number of what we would call in UN Habitat people on the move. 40 million migrants, 21 million displaced people between refugees and internally displaced people. Therefore, the need of urban environment to actually accommodate these that are wide or big majority of these people end up in urban settlements. Also, the fragility of the region due to different socio-political causes, revolution, civil war, protests, but also and probably mostly impacted by climate change. The region is severely water scarce, and this has a huge implication actually on the trend in terms of displacement. So how do we deal with that now from the point of view of land governance? I mean, there are two main options, camps or non-camps. For camps, I think we know them. We know they're not sustainable. Less and less people actually reside in camps, but indeed there will be a need of strengthening more, at least temporarily suitable housing, land and property rights arrangement that can increase the sustainability of people who have been living in camp for decades. But what is perhaps more interesting for me is really looking at broadening the solutions and better structuring the solution for those who will be not in camps. Because I say the numbers are huge, are increasing, and therefore the urban environment in the region needs to be able to provide housing solution, land governance solution, tenure solution for these people as a part of their daily routine, I would say. So this solution can be provided directly by the authorities in a smaller number of cases. But what for us at UN Habitat is really important is instead the capacity of cities to increase the availability of suitable temporary housing and land tenure solution in a structured manner. And this will basically happen by increasing the rights, the land rights and land tenure security and housing rights of the host communities, and providing suitable options so that the host communities and the families can actually create ways for the people who are there really on a temporary basis to access affordable and adequate housing. This obviously looks a lot about rental or temporary permission to stay in exchange, for example, for cash. That's the typical rental, basic, but maybe negotiated rates, in exchange for labor or services that the migrants, the refugees provide. But also in exchange of other incentive for the host community that will help them as well to benefit from this mutually sort of symbiotic relationship. There are many actually, now we don't have time to go into it, but there are many cases and examples already in the region that could be leveraged and institutionalized further. Also tax incentive, other type of incentive to actually make sure that these solutions are provided by the people, the society, the private sector as well. And the need of authorities, institutions to focus on brokering these agreements between the host communities and the refugees, shouldering some of the liabilities that are obviously implied in the condition that these people have. Maybe they don't have papers, maybe they don't have enough documents to be going through the system as it is now. And that's why there is need to actually make this system evolve and as well provide dispute resolution in case disputes arise, which is of course often the case. I would like just to conclude by mentioning briefly, talking to the point of neoliberalism and how land governance relates to that, can speak to that. There are some aspects that are very, very important and needs to be perhaps further understood, is the fact that having functioning land markets is crucial. And that requires the need for clear and fair land valuation and compensation processes, monitoring land prices, to see that we see that in some cities, particularly unexpectedly, the land prices and the cost of housing driven mostly by land prices is inexplicably high. And this is due really by that dysfunctioning of the land registration system, the land administration, by the lack of actually services and infrastructure, the lack of insufficient formal offer of land, and also by the lack or the distorted or insufficiently planned or insufficiently managed land and property taxation. Land and property taxation is actually a key tool to mitigate and keep the cost of land, particularly urban land, affordable. It's counterintuitive, but is really, in fact, the case. And we would really see that better land taxation discussion and practices in the region will really help in keeping affordable the offer of housing and land for the benefit of the broader population. I would like to stop here and thank you very much again for this opportunity. Back to you, Chair.
Thanks a lot, Umbretta. Yeah, I mean, you touched so many different important related issues when it comes to land and urbanism. Yeah, mainly I would recall informality, camps and hosting communities, and then the neoliberal like real estate market as well. So yeah, this is already published in a report, right, for the Arab Land Initiative, or this is like or partially at least. I mean, do we have this as conclusive kind of findings for many years of work that can be really used as material for teaching and for universities to, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there is a lot that we have
the region, I mean,
globally, and then we are putting together more strongly the cases for the region. So we do have case studies, but now I've sort of compacted some of these topics, and we would definitely be happy to work with the university, and we are actually starting this process with some universities to see how to adapt some of these curricula to the universities and adapt the global curriculum, perhaps complementing with the examples from the region. Which there are many. So I'll be happy maybe to dig some literature that talks to some of these points in the coming days.
I would be glad. I mean, we would appreciate if you can share with us. I mean, whatever you want to share can be easily, it can reach all our audience. We have all of the contacts, and also, I mean, we have representatives here from 6 different countries, academics mostly, I mean, today and tomorrow still. So yeah, I would say maybe it's about time to talk about land when it comes to teaching urban planning, and yeah, thanks a lot. And I would close the session and the day now. So we'll see you all tomorrow. Thank you all, and have a nice evening or have a nice day wherever you are. And yeah, thank you.